first point is really, let's try and understand your audience, which is of course the investor. So first question for you guys, what is easier for an investor? Selecting a startup which will become successful or rejecting a startup which he thinks might not be successful? If an investor looks at 100 pitch decks, how many do you think he selects for further investigation and further analysis? 10 to 15, right? And so he's rejecting 85. And amongst the 10 to 15 which he's selecting, he's spending more time and trying to explore deeper to make the investment. So clearly rejecting a startup is easier. And so, what is the point of saying this, making this statement? He's looking out to do that. He's looking out for the common pitfalls we all make, which tells him this startup is not going to make it. And so the investor is looking for two things. He's looking for things which he thinks can make a startup successful, but equally he's looking very hard at things which tell him, no, this doesn't cut it. And so it's very important when we pitch to investors to figure out what are the areas that he'll be watching out for to reject. That's point number one. If you are in front of an investor, you've already crossed the first hurdle. And that first hurdle is crossed if you have a good pitch. If you're standing in front of an investor, he's already committed the time to spend with you because he thinks you have a chance of success. And therefore, you have to make the most of that opportunity. Pitching in front of an investor is an opportunity which you should maximize because you've already crossed the first hurdle. And the pitch is a key element of getting you that audience. So we talked about, investors are looking for certain things and they are watching out for other things, right? So what is the investor looking for? Clearly, the investor is looking for returns. What is he looking for in terms of returns? How much returns? Is it 4x, 5x is money? In what kind of time frame? Is it 10x? Is it 20x? Is it 30x? So venture capital investment is a typical risk-based investing model where, if a guy invests in 10 startups, 2 or 3 will give outsized returns, 3 or 4 will give middling returns, say 3-4x, and the rest he will lose all his capital. And therefore, even though at a portfolio level, venture capital investors will look at 3x, 4x, 5x returns, at an individual investment, when he's looking at your startup, the investor is actually looking at, you have a chance of giving him a 10x return on investment, 20x return on investment. And so just think a little deeply about this. So I have startup founders saying that, I want X amount dollars of valuation and I want $1 million to be invested and I will give a 20% stake. So let's just stick with that. What does that mean? An investor is putting in $1 million and gets a 20% stake. And he has to be convinced that he will make $10 million in say 5, 6, 7 year time frame. It means that your company has to be valued. If you raise no further money, and let's assume a 50% dilution, that means when you raise money, even the investor stake goes down because the new investor gets some stake. Let's say there is a total of 50% dilution which happens. Okay. So he has, let's say at the end of when he's exiting after 6-7 years, we've raised money, his stake has come down from 20% to say 11, 12, or for easy math, let's take 10%. So he has 10% stake in the money. To get $10 million, you have to be valued at $100 million. In his mind, he's doing that math mentally and saying that if I'm putting $1 million into this company, I need to be convinced that this company in 5, 6, 7 years can be valued at $100 million, which is 750 crores. So that is the benchmark the investor has in mind, and which is a fairly steep benchmark for a lot of the businesses. So therefore, your task is of convincing him that he can actually make that return. And a lot of people will say, no, 3-4x is fine. But the investor also knows that he will make mistakes and he will back startups which will not succeed. Yours could be one of them, right? So for an individual investment, he's looking at that kind of a return. So I see a lot of slide decks where people promise a 3x, 4x return, and that's not going to cut it. At each startup, he's looking at a 10x plus kind of a return. He has to be convinced of that. He's taken a decision to invest in a startup. Whether he's made a successful investment will not be apparent in 6 to 7 years. It will be apparent within a year, 12 to 18 months. Why? Because most of the startups these days are burning money. So every month they are spending more than they are making in terms of revenues because they are building a business. Fair enough. And they are also reaching some milestones. They're getting some customers, they're showing some traction in the market, they are getting some users, which is validating their model. So The investor is looking at your milestones and burn because that is when the result will come out. That is what drives when the result will come out, because he has to be sure that given the milestones you're going to show, you say, okay, in the next 12 months, this is what I'm going to do and achieve in terms of customers, in terms of revenues, in terms of my product, and I'm going to burn this much of money. So you're going to run out of money in 12 to 18 months, let's say. He has to be sure that somebody looking at those milestones is willing to give you the next round of capital. Because if that doesn't happen, the exam results are out, right? The investment has worked or not worked. And so a lot of people think that the time frame investors have, it takes a lot of time, etc. But the investors are also on a treadmill in terms of time. And so they are actually looking at what can you deliver in the 6, 9, 12-month time frame so that you can raise additional money. A lot of the startup founders will say, hey, this takes time to build, etc. But in the investor's mind, it is really critical that when somebody looks at you 12 months down the line, based on what you have achieved, they will be willing to invest money at a higher valuation. So that is why a lot of investors will actually talk to later stage investors to get a sense on what are the areas they are interested in and what are the milestones they want to see. The investor is actually looking at a very compelling is very simply put, is that he looks at your business model, he looks at your pitch and feels compelled that this is really something which is worth investing in. An investor is looking at hundreds of startups. And when you are hearing a story, you say, oh, I've heard this story before. So it has to be very differentiated. Please know, in whichever sector you are in, there are many companies and they're all going and telling a story on how they're going to be successful. So your story has to be very sharply differentiated on how you are different, what is unique about you. And your story also has to be very cogent. By cogent, I mean all the elements need to come together to be consistent. So a cogent story is one where you're solving the right problem, the solution is actually solving that problem, customers are willing to pay for it, you make money while offering that service to customers, and you're going to be able to execute as per your plans. Scalability. It's about growth. You have to show growth. How are you going to grow? One last limited point. Why this is about a story, telling a story to investors. Why a story? Because stories are memorable. It's easier to remember stories, and remember that investor, whoever is that individual sitting there, has to go to an investment committee or his team and he has to tell them your story. And so you must make your story easy for him to remember, give him all the elements in that story when he is questioned by his investment committee to be able to answer those questions. And so remember that there are layers of storytelling which are going to happen, and the investor is always trying to figure out when he's asking you the questions, because he's going to be asked those questions and he has to answer those questions in your story. And somebody mentioned this quality of the team. I think these days a lot of early stage investments happen based on the founding team, because you have an idea, you have some hypothesis on why your startup is going to scale up. Finally, people look at the people. Can I work with these people? Is this founding team working well together? Do they have complementary business skill sets? We'll get into a little bit more about the team, but do they really understand their business and what's happening in the market? And can they execute well? Because finally, it's about the future, and future is about execution. I think these are kind of the 4 things I thought were very important, and the investor must have extremely high conviction on these elements to invest.